Hello and welcome back to GGP. Thank you for being here with us. And more, I am thankful that I'm here with April Walsh from Thirsty Sword Lesbians, RPG, tabletop award winning tabletop RPG. Oh my god, there's so many hyphens, so many commas. How do you describe, first of all, Thirsty Sword Lesbians to someone who does not already know about this fantastic game?
Yeah, and thanks for having me. So, Thirsty Sword Lesbians is a tabletop role-playing game that celebrates queer love and power in any setting where swords cross and hearts race. It's a positive experience about telling stories together. It's very narrative focused, very relationship and emotions focused, and it's just queer from top to bottom.
I love it. Like the ways that you develop your characters, the ways that you are telling the stories that are in there. Um, Actually, to jump on a little bit of that, like I feel like when a lot of people think about tabletop RPGs, they're thinking about Dungeons and Dragons, which is the most popular one there. But I feel like you create such like an amazing not just world, which is the things that you can do, what you're bringing into it, but you're also like the ways that you create the characters, even down to things that you want in the story and things you don't want to include in the story. I think is amazing. How do you like? Let's start at the beginning. Like, how do you even start to address or start to build the pieces of something like this?
Yeah, so in the TTRPG space, there are a lot of ways to slice up the kinds of games there are. But one big distinction is this a simulationist game where we're simulating swinging swords at giants and so on? Or is this a narrative game where the mechanics are speaking to story beats more so than trying to simulate a sort of physical system? And so Thirsty Sword Lesbians is very much in the story games category, where if you roll and you get a high number, that is an upbeat. Things in the story are looking good for our heroes, and it might not map directly to success or failure. Maybe the upbeat is that you get totally lost and stumble upon something fortuitous, right? Whereas a downbeat, a narrative downbeat might be, yeah, you're doing great, you're like getting through the opposition, you bust in, but it turns out that the villain is already talking to your ex and they're ready for you or something. And so it lends to a play pattern where every roll of the dice results in something interesting and important happening. And in between those two extremes is the mixed beat, which is very, very juicy, where something good happens, but there's a cost, or things look grim, but there's a silver lining, or you get something and the opposition gets something. And that very much speaks to the way that these games are designed to be a conversation. A lot of the mechanics will invite you to define part of what happens, and then someone else to define part of what happens. Like if you're flirting with someone, then obviously you are describing what your character is doing, and if that's the kind of thing that might be appealing to the other person, then depending on the dice, they will pick some options from their list. They might like flush and act awkward. They might give you a mechanical token that represents emotional influence. But at the same time, there's another level of safety built in, right? So you start with it's a conversation. You're not like rolling dice to compel someone to feel away. That's not a thing that happens in this game. And I think it's really important that you not model relationships and emotions in that like adversarial way where you're trying to conquer an obstacle. You're going to use the same mechanic as you would to hammer down a door. That's gross, that's creepy, and it's not fun to do it that way. So you asked how you start, and I just zoomed through a whole bunch of
No, no,
different
no, no.
queer
You're
games.
laying down the foundation that a lot of people probably don't even know about, which comes to the game. To go into this conversation, I think one of the interesting thing is this conversation that you do have as the game master or gay master,
Game master, yes. Yeah.
as you are building the story that is there. I find it interesting that your story, as the person sort of behind the sheet, you're not rolling dice. You're sort of like going in and you're kind of, it's a cooperative storytelling game, obviously, but there's also other things, and you also have things called threads,
Strings, yeah.
strings.
Yeah.
Sorry, strings that you're also attaching to them. Can you sort of talk about like how, what is your sort of approach of creating this cooperative storytelling game? Because I think you do it in such a beautiful way that has more of a shared responsibility more than an adversarial responsibility that you see in a lot of other titles.
Yeah. So I think that part of that is making sure that every die result leads to something fun and interesting, right, for the table. So it's not, oh no, I rolled low dice, now the game master is going to be mean to me. Like that's not the dynamic at all. So and you referred to the strings, which are a lot of story games have this kind of mechanic that rewards you for doing something that is suboptimal but is dramatically juicy and interesting. So that you really shouldn't like go off with the snake woman who is like telling you she's going to whisper you a secret. That you're just going to get into trouble, or they're trying to like isolate the other part of your group, but she's really hot, and so I am going to wave a GM string, and if you just go with her, then you get to mark an XP, right? And so it creates two things. One, it creates a little bit of player level temptation that parallels the character level temptation, so you feel a tiny bit of what your character is feeling. But it also creates just permission at the table to do that thing where you don't have to play optimally. In Thirsty Sword Lesbians, by default, you're a bunch of disasters. You've all got your own, stuff that you're going through. Each playbook is actually centered around an emotional conflict. Like, I really want to be close to people, but I'm afraid of being vulnerable. So you're not supposed to be playing, optimally. The way that you might in like a really deadly traditional combat simulation game where like, well, my character would do this. Like, well, but then we're all going to get killed and that's going to destroy everyone's fun, right?
Right.
But this is a game where you can play like flawed people. And sometimes people are nervous, like, I don't know if I can play it. I'm not very good at flirting. Like one of these playbooks literally has a move for blurting out embarrassing facts at their crush. Right? Like you can be awkward. Trust me. That is not an obstacle to being a
roll for awkward. Yes. Oh God.
Yeah, it's called I like snails.
I like
if you have a crush on someone, then you can just like blurt out.
I like when snails crawl across my face.
And then each of the playbooks also, when you become smitten with someone, which is always the player's choice. There's no mechanic that tells you now you're smitten because you whatever rolled.
Yeah, you have like a certain number of like hits. You've been smoked enough.
Yeah. Then you ask a sort of very loaded question, right? So that spooky witch character who can blurt out snail facts or whatever facts you want.
Yeah.
The move is called "Why did I mention the snails?" And it's like, what obvious challenge or what like obvious thing about you are you sure is going to make them reject you?
Right.
Or like the trickster who fears being vulnerable. It's what secret do you have that you're sure would make them reject you? And then other characters who have loyalties pulling them in different directions. It's always, by declaring smitten, you've said, this is a plot thread that you want to focus on. You want this to be interesting and fraught. So let's figure out how, in connection with your playbook's emotional themes, there are going to be obstacles to this relationship. Because you can always just like, yes, we get along great, and there are no obstacles to us being together, and now we're going to make out. and that's cool. You could do that. But if you want some more drama,
Yes.
then the
Yes.
mechanics will help you do that, right? The mechanics
Yes.
will give you interesting obstacles in your path, and make it more of like a romance drama, as opposed to like a fluff fic, which is completely valid. That's when people write fanfic that just feels good,
Right.
and that's completely valid too. But these characters tend to be a little more disastrous than that.
I love it. Disastrous characters doing dramatic things. This is a very juicy, a very like adventurous, but like a lot of emotions. It's almost like a soap opera mixed with like Dungeons, D&D that goes into it. I know we talked a little bit about self-publishing. Like
Mhm.
you have the idea, you have this world in your head, you have sort of the stories that you want to tell and those emotions that you want to bring out. Like how where do you go from there? Like how do you start to build that world? How do you go from person with an idea to award winning tabletop designer?
Yeah, well, let me give you the 100% results guaranteed roadmap.
Thank goodness.
No, I think that one of the really interesting things about the TTRPG space is that there is a very low barrier to publishing and potentially getting noticed.
Mhm.
So, a lot of indie RPG stuff is published on itch.io. And when Thirsty Sword Lesbians started out, it was a PDF exported from a GDoc, and I had commissioned one piece of art for it. And, like 140 people bought it on itch,
Of
just by
course.
sort of word of mouth. And that got the attention of a publisher. And then the publisher picked it up, and then we did a crowdfund. And then the crowdfund exploded because at each step, I think a lot of people have underestimated the game. Um, it was sold out on release weekend. Like I went to my local gaming store on like release day, like I'm gonna take a picture with my game. And they're like, we sold all of them. I'm like, well, I guess that's good news, but I did want to take a picture with my game on a shelf at like a real store.
Oh,
Um, and I think getting more into the how to, in the indie TTRPG space, there are a lot of sort of communities of design, and some of those are focused on something that I think is really important to, especially telling queer stories, and that is when a game system provides an open license for people to hack and make add-ons and everything for the game system. So Thirsty Sword Lesbians is offered under a Creative Commons share alike license so that people can make their own playbooks and settings and sell them, and that's great. Like I, I buy all of them essentially, and other people do too. And I think that if you're starting out as an indie TTRPG creator, then starting out in that space where there is sort of a community of people invested in a system who sort of know how it works, who can talk about game design concepts back and forth, is a really helpful way to get past that first hurdle of just finding someone else you can talk to about your ideas. You might have feedback, or just might be a sounding board who can ask the right questions. And Thirsty Sword Lesbians itself is part of the Apocalypse World family of games in the sense that it has a basic 2d6 plus stats move structure. It has like playbooks, which are the different archetypes, which have moves and their own features. It diverges from Apocalypse World and the other games in that family in a bunch of ways as well, as many of the games do, right? So there is a pool of sort of design chunks that you can look at and say, like, I think that would work well for what I'm going for. And then there's stuff that you can throw out. And that's also really helpful as a starting designer. And even, I mean, it's definitely game design to figure out how those chunks are going to work together, which ones you can't just copy, what concepts to throw out entirely, and then you add your own inspiration to it. So and then for different, if there is a game that you're passionate about, there's probably a community doing design around it. Some games are, explicit, right? Like, here's a license, please do stuff, please
Right.
make things. You can put this cute "powered by lesbians" logo on your thing that you made. And
I like
yeah,
going into community because it feels like community is such an important thing. Like you it was a Kickstarter, and then like working with the community to sort of design this. Like, what were some of the lessons that you learned when you had this sort of like this this idea, this sort of like world that you wanted to have, and then all of a sudden you have all these other people starting to come in and starting to like, come into your world. Like, what is that like?
yeah, I think from the start, designing a TTRPG, I have wanted to help facilitate people telling their own stories. So it's not, I want you to run through like my story, or I want to invite you to play in my worlds, but I also want to invite you to make your own worlds and, tell stories that I would never have thought of. And one of the ways that we did that was we hired 5 contributing authors to write settings for the core book. So not just sort of stretch goals in the Kickstarter, but actually a part of the core book that everyone's going to see when they get the book. They're going to see the Violet Dangereuse, the steampunk labor organizers who conjure swords of poetry out of their chests and fight on dirigibles against the robber barons. And they're going to see the Uisa Revolution, the Puerto Rico inspired anti-colonial fantasy setting with airships and monster girls, and and then the coffee shop with a portal to a fantasy world, where the fantasy world is being threatened, and so is the coffee shop because of gentrification and evil real estate developers who you can run it either pure modern world,
Oh,
or just a little conceit where it's the modern world but it's also normal to challenge people to sword fights.
as you
So
do, yeah. I
you're
love it.
right, like the swords can be literal or they can be a metaphor, right? Like there's a chess setting where you use the same mechanics for like that intense conflict, because it doesn't have to be swords, it just has to be a kind of like intense intimate conflict where you're really focused on the other person, that can change the way you relate to each other depending on like how it goes and like how you flirt during it. So including, obviously there's no one person or 6 people who are going to represent all of queer experience. And so, I think for me, the approach that I wanted to take was to make it as adaptable as possible. And you'll see in the there are a bunch of pages devoted to how to hack the game, right? Like
Oh,
the choice that I made here means that the game has this tone. If you made a different choice, that would change the tone in this way.
huh.
And then, a lot of it is interconnected. So some of it is like, you know, there's a trend in game design to like not have this, but here's how I'm using that in ways that are sort of narratively important, and you're going to need to replace those if you mess with that element. So it's absolutely designed for people to hack, to add on to, from just like adding custom moves, custom playbooks, to writing your own game
Oh my
that
god.
takes some of the tech that has been developed for Thirsty Sword Lesbians and then says something different with it. And that doesn't feel like a loss to me at all. That feels like accomplishing the mission of providing people with the means, and inspiration and advice that will help them tell their own stories.
That's amazing. Like it's more than just like a guidebook to the world that you're creating. You're actually almost creating like a guidebook to game design itself, where you are going through and being like, this is why this is here, but if you want to change it or pull this out or do these other things, you can do this, and this.
Yeah, I didn't in the first release and a couple of the beta versions. There was no like world, right? And then okay, well here's like a sample adventure, but obviously you don't have to be in space. You could be pirates, and so like but people wanted more like examples, like concrete examples to, take and just run with immediately. And so like I gradually added those, much to my editor's chagrin. With each one, I did some new experiment. Like, well, here's what happens if you have custom relationship questions tied to your setting.
Ooh.
And my editor is like, so we have to format them all kind of the same, and they're all different. And so like that's sort of a part of the story that I haven't told yet, which is working with a publisher, right? Like,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
signed
yeah.
on, we did this enormous Kickstarter. And one of the reasons that I wanted to sign on with a publisher is because I don't know what I'm doing, right? I don't know how to get something published
Well,
or
obviously you
distributed.
do know what you're doing.
I do
You've come
now, but
you've come this far. You've told a story. Like you have like a small army of people who are coming in, just pulling books off the just grabbing, and there's ripping and tearing. Maybe some kissing. Who
there's
knows?
duels over the last copy. It's traditional to fight a duel to see
You
who gets the
have
last
to.
copy at the store. Yeah.
You have to.
No, but like,
Yeah.
this isn't my profession. I'm a public interest lawyer. I fight for your speech rights and privacy and stuff. And I'm actually very busy. And I'm not going to learn how to print a book and distribute it and everything. But my good friends at Evil Hat, they know all that. And so, like, for me, it was a no-brainer. I think if I hadn't, it would be an incredibly inspired PDF exported from Google Docs that probably wouldn't be like receiving awards and as well known, because Evil Hat made a beautiful product out of the idea. And also they know how to run a Kickstarter, and the Kickstarter pays for the gay art, and the gay art is one of my other prime motivations for commercializing the game. And Kanisha Bryant did the cover art and the iconics, and they're all gorgeous. The second book is, I think, even more gorgeous than the first one, maybe just because it's bigger, so we get more art. But I've sneaked a lot of my OCs, my like original characters, into the art. If you look at the like iconic Infamous, the blue monster girl with the tentacle hair and like the sea urchin armor, that's Tentacula. She has a long history. We love Tentacula. Whereas others were sort of like created fresh for the book. But the publisher had the expertise to make that happen. And I was speaking with someone who does self-publish, and they were saying, you could sign on, they're good, they have a good reputation, but like the publisher takes a big cut. You'll make more money if you just sell it directly. I'm like, I won't, because it will be an unformatted PDF with one piece of art. And like, I'll buy more art as people buy it, but like for me, at in that role, doing this where it's not something that I have the experience in, but I've sort of been able to do the writing part and the game design part. It made total sense to then work with a publisher, and of course you want to research your publisher, make sure they have a good reputation for the kind of games that you want to make, and for actually paying the people who make games with them. But that's another situation where just getting into a space, and unfortunately there's not like a central space that I can tell you, go to this website, this is where all the indie game designers are sharing the scuttlebutt and the game design thoughts. It really is sort of like, what kind of game are you designing for, and it's pretty fluid too, but doing the work to sort of research that, find that, be a part of that community, do some design, some hacks. I think there's another route too, that involves more like streaming on Twitch.
Yes.
And that might be, it's a bit of a conflation to think that, streamer skills are the same as game designer skills, but that conflation is present in the market, right? And there are people who are great at both, which is amazing too. But that can be an avenue to help, find the people who are doing the design, as well as for Thirsty Sword Lesbians, people wanted to run it on their streams. And so, particularly during the Kickstarter, I absolutely want to come run it on your stream.
Absolutely.
And so that's another way of engaging with sort of that mode is offer to run them your game that does like exactly a neat thing that maybe they haven't seen before, or they haven't seen it done well before. And then get it in front of people. And some of the early streamers have been, the diehard fans who have then run it 5 times on their own, and I think that's awesome. So
Yeah, it's amazing to actually see a lot of the stories and a lot of the worlds that are starting to come out of sort of the Twitch space, where you do see almost professional actors starting to come in and get very excited about actually, being able to play these different characters or explore these different relationships that
I love
they're.
it. I love seeing it. I love when people post fan art or just like session synopses. And then the two forms of fan mail that are my absolute favorite are um, playing Thirsty Sword Lesbians helped me figure out my gender.
Oh, wow.
Oh, that's so good.
That's
It's so good,
huge.
right? Like,
That's amazing. Like
yeah, and then I
again, it's
cry.
it's a
And then
way to like explore that space.
well, and RPGs were
We're
that for me as
yeah.
well, but I think it's Thirsty Sword Lesbians does a lot of work to create an environment that's going to respect a wide range of individuals, and it's going to insulate you from the enforcement of like patriarchal gender norms or sexuality norms, and all that it takes for a lot of people to figure out that they're not cis or not het is to be free for a minute from those pressures, right? Because
Mhm.
that's what bottles people up inside a narrow identity that's prescribed by the society that we're in. And so, like any little crack in space or permission to do that, right? Like in RPGs, where you're like, oh, I'm gonna play a girl, um, or like you see the comments on like the YouTube trans voice training stuff, like I'm just doing this so that I can role play girls in RPGs. Okay,
Yeah.
I mean,
Like
maybe.
what? Okay, so you're touching on a little bit of like your sort of history with RPGs. Like what was when did you start getting into RPGs? Like what was sort
Oh
of
my
like your
gosh!
experience
All right,
getting
second
into
grade. Uh,
second? Whoa,
Second grade.
love it.
I ran the Star Wars West End Games RPG on the school bus. We rolled D6s in a shoebox.
There you go. Yeah.
And I remember we had like a Wookiee, a droid, and a Jedi walk into I don't know, we were in second grade, walk into an ice cream parlor. But I found my notes from those games, and it's like drawings of spaceships
Oh my
with like
god.
stats written next to them. I can't make sense of it, but I mean that's my origin with it. I played a lot of Dungeons and Dragons,
Sure.
played some Shadowrun, some Paranoia, like
Hmm.
tried a bunch of crunchy games. And I was pretty much always running something or other and then playing other games. And then around 2012, 2011, I started to notice like the narrative game side of things. So like Fate was a big influence. Fate has those fate points that give
Yeah.
you a cookie if you do the thing that like causes interesting trouble. So that's like a great piece of narrative game design tech. Um, and yeah, so then I knew there was this whole other family of narrative games and tried those out. uh, in terms of game design, um, I mean, I did a repaint of D&D as Redwall, where you play as like mice with swords in
That's
middle school,
fantastic.
right? So like that was my first hack. And then I wrote like a terrible like D100 system in like a space setting of my own design, with like really weird. It had a random character advancement,
Oh wow.
right? Like that's weird. And I want to think about like what's the right game for that. Because there might
Right.
be a game where like that's the right way to advance. They might maybe one of those games where you don't know your full history and you're discovering it, or like a mystery game where like
Oh
maybe you randomly advance into being the killer.
yeah.
Um,
That makes sense.
anyway,
But okay, so we're coming we're starting this journey, this long trail from the school bus in
yep.
second grade. Now we're moving all the way to the digital Nebula event where you are nominated for Best Writing in a game. Last year, obviously, it was Hades, which was a huge hit. You are up for Best Writing, and you win. Not only is this a huge accomplishment, but it's also the first time that a tabletop RPG has won this award. What is going through your head? What are you thinking as your name is your name is getting called
Right.
out?
I mean, I thought the title was too queer and we weren't going to win an award. I like almost didn't write an acceptance speech. Um, but I'm glad I did because we won. Right? Like I wasn't afraid we don't deserve to win it. I was just thinking, we probably aren't going to. And of course, all of the RPGs that were nominated are fantastic RPGs. And I think one of the things that I've sort of reflected on and heard people talking about afterwards is, what does this mean in the future? Because this is the first tabletop role-playing game to receive a Nebula Award. And Nebula is a very prestigious award, and part of that is its history, and also the way that it's selected. It's not something that can be dominated by the incumbents in the industry with sort of the most marketing. Anyway.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Like it's insulated from that,
Right.
and that's part of the prestige. And now a TTRPG one. So does that mean that the medium is going to get more attention or respect? Does We don't know. This was just a couple weeks ago, right? Like we don't know what this is going to mean, but I do think it would be really cool if it did mean more attention, more sort of appreciation for the artistry of TTRPGs that goes into a ton of the indie games that get made that are really their passion projects, that are saying important things about people's experiences or people's perspectives on society, and that deserves to be recognized because it's art, and it's just a really neat art form because of how participatory it is. You as a game designer are creating norms and vibes and narrative rules and roles. But even before we get to hacking the system, you are inviting people to then create the central characters within the bounds that you've set, and then tell a story about them. And that's just a really different mode of engaging with culture than like receiving a movie, right?
Yeah.
And it's a lot more like the fan culture of receiving a movie, saying, "Well, that's terrible. I'm going to go write 200 pages of like slash fic about how these superheroes like should have been gay," and then like that's art.
Yeah.
That's not like an entertainment product. That is art that someone is making to say something like true and meaningful. And like TTRPGs kind of have that built right in. So I would be really excited to see more attention on it. I think all of the streaming has helped with that as well, right? Like people get to watch and see that joint creative process happening, and then they do fan art of the stream. It's just concentric circles of culture and creation
one feeds
that
into the other.
A monolith, right?
Yes.
You don't have one company that says, I own all of your thirsty sword lesbians.
I own all your thirsty swords. I shall drink your thirsty sword lesbians.
Yeah.
Obviously we have a lot of students who like to watch who are also looking into getting into game design, and I think you have created like both a world that is very imaginative as well as something that is very thoughtful in the players who are actually participating within the world itself. What are some of like pieces of advice that you would give to game designers who want to sort of follow in your footsteps?
Well, I think, if I could build right off of what you just said, I think if you want people to emotionally invest and explore emotionally heavy topics, it needs to be safe for them to do that. And what that looks like in a TTRPG, there are a lot of layers to it, right? Like I could give a talk just on like safety in TTRPGs, but making sure, like we touched on ideas of consent and making things a conversation, right? So you don't get forced into feeling a particular emotional way. Whenever there's a playbook or a mechanic that proposes to explore something that's potentially really sensitive, then you've got both the sort of built-in safety of the way the mechanics work. You have a layer of safety tools that are like calling a safe word, or just saying we need to check in, just setting a norm that people's feelings matter and aren't going to be steamrolled because like, well, this toxic and hurtful thing would happen logically, therefore you have to be re-traumatized in the interest of the narrative. Like we're putting people above that. And then I mean, for Thirsty Sword Lesbians, and in general, I think the most important safety tool is just who do you have at your table. And so one of the reasons that I wanted the name to be the way that it is to attract the kind of people who think that sounds like fun, and to repel the kind of people who are like, ooh, lesbians, what is this wokeism? And like that's an element of safety. It's creating a game that when people come together to play it, they're more likely to be there for the experience and for like those relationships. So that is all in service not only of people's well-being, but also of just being able to explore heavy emotional topics, right? Like these people are having enormous feelings, they're having larger than life feelings, and a lot of the time people look at the playbooks and be like, that person who's always giving and doesn't know how to take care of themselves, like that's too real, I can't play that. Like you don't have to, sure. But like it's there if you want a playbook to reinforce the idea that like, yes, it's okay to learn to have boundaries and do self-care while playing a disaster shield maiden who's going to jump in front of every danger until she gets totally burned out and has a breakdown, right. Which can be fun in fiction, right. But you don't want it to be what's happening at the player level. So that I think it's really fun when games evoke emotions, and so sort of building out the technology and methodology for how to encourage players to engage on that level is pretty exciting. So for TTRPGs, these are some of my ideas. There are games that will take out the random element of dice in favor of like tokens, so you're always sort of in control of like what kind of narrative beat comes next, which is this totally valid, leads to like different kinds of stories. And there can be a sort of additional element of safety where you never get like the surprise of a downbeat, as opposed to we got the downbeat, we need to make sure that it's something that's positive and interesting. And then there are games that are sort of in between where you roll dice, but the person who rolled has more control of picking what kind of consequence happens. So I think it depends on what tone, what topic you're engaging with, and what kind of stories you want to emerge from it.
Love it. That's fantastic. This is honestly absolutely amazing world design, teaching how to both play the game as well as to create your own games. Thirsty Sword Lesbians has it all. Where can people find Thirsty Sword Lesbians, as well as where can people find out more about you?
Yeah, so just visit sword.gay, and that'll take you to the Thirsty Sword Lesbian site.
Perfect.
Medieval Hat. And for me, my games Twitter is, so I publish, my imprint is Gay Spaceship Games. So it's at Gay Spaceship GMS, because there aren't enough characters for games.
Right.
And that's where I talk about RPG stuff and post snippets of stuff I'm working on, and retweet art of hot queers with swords. So
who doesn't love that? I love it. all of this. Thank you so much, April, for your time and for your knowledge and for just making a fantastic RPG game that people can enjoy and play online and inspire others to make queer art and hopefully inspire others to play more queer games. So I thank you, and hopefully everyone at home also got inspired by everything you were talking about. So with that, go out, play some games, be thirsty.
Thanks so much, and great luck with all of your projects.
Thanks.